payment for local public goods. The next issue which I alluded to is public goods, things like police, fire protection, schools, emergency medical services. But before getting into the specifics of police or fire protection or whatever, it's best to just deal with the funding of public goods on a general level. This would then apply to any public good. And in theory, I could end there, but I won't. For police, they will protect you whether you have paid or not. That's generally what society wants, and it's incumbent on police to capture the criminals to prevent future crimes, even if it means saving a non-payer to do so. So why pay for police if they will protect you whether you pay or not? And where your contribution to the collective police fund will have little or no effect on what police services you receive. For firefighters, they will put out the fire of an uninsured house near the insured houses in order to protect the insured ones. And so, why pay for fire protection if they will protect you whether you pay or not? And your contributions to the collective fund will have little or no effect. How do we overcome the free rider problem in regards to these services? Well, without a state, I see this being solved through two mechanisms. One is through dominant assurance pacts. Most people want police protection, but they don't want to be the lone sucker who pays for it. The contract would go like this. You would say, quote, I am willing to pay for police services if 70% of property owners in the area are also willing to pay. This limits the effect of free riding to a maximum of 30%. It doesn't eliminate the free rider, and Homo economicus still wouldn't pay in this environment. Homo economicus would go to the wall. He doesn't care. Like, if there's any free riding, he's going to free ride. But it does limit the free rider problem to 30%, or if you want to put it up to 80% dominant assurance, then it limits the free rider problem to 20%. It's a useful device, but it's not an ace in the hole. The second mechanism are just stars in the window, wristbands, or some card that verifies that you have paid for the public services. If you don't have any of these things, and you're in your 30s, let's say, then you are a mooch and a parasite on society. People pay thousands on nice cars and nice clothes, and pay thousands to make their homes look nice on status symbols. They would pay to have the wristband that says, I pay for public services, for the same reason they pay for other status symbols. Before just laughing this invocation out of hand, which I know some will, recall that roughly 23 million people were a part of the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, at its height in 1935 during the Great Depression. The NRA was an organization among businesses to all agree to do business according to the NRA Fair Code, which, among other things, required businesses to artificially keep up prices and wages. Firms went along with this because being part of the NRA allowed you to hang the Blue Eagle in your window, and this was seen as patriotic. I obviously don't agree with the economic policies pushed forward by the NRA, but it was seen as patriotic to do this. I don't have any direct data on this, but a safe guess based on the numbers today and the trends is that about 4% of the U.S. population were government employees between 1933 and 1935, the years in which the NRA was in existence. The labor force today represents 50.3% of the population and is about 154 million people in total. Assuming a roughly equal population to labor force rate in the 1930s, which is not an unreasonable assumption given that less women worked professionally and a larger percentage of the population were children, then the labor force in the U.S. during the period of the NRA can be estimated to be roughly 63 million. Of these, roughly 5 million were in government and 13 million were unemployed, leaving 45 million that were even open to being part of the NRA. Of these, 23 million, or about 51% of the eligible labor force, joined the NRA in less than 2 years. Certainly it would have gotten larger if the NRA hadn't been ruled as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Now, and the reason it was ruled unconstitutional is because the state enforced compliance. That is, the state was enforcing compliance with this organization. Now, I think the NRA was first-order nonsense, but it was a technically voluntary association. Compliance was an issue, and firms would secretly charge less than the NRA mandates and secretly pay less than the NRA mandates in order to stay in business. But even that is telling. Businesses wanted to hang that Blue Eagle in their window because if they didn't, customers would walk right by onto a store that did have the Blue Eagle. While it's horrible that firms had to kowtow to such economic illiteracy, it does illustrate the ability of society to organize without a state to require entities to behave in a way they wouldn't if they all just acted individualistically. If these firms all just acted individualistically, they would lower prices, lower wages, and, in my estimation, would have recovered a lot faster. Of course, with the NRA, the state enforced compliance. In order to be able to display the Blue Eagle, you had to comply with the NRA's code, or else the state would come down on you. And that's why it was ruled unconstitutional. But in a stateless society, the legal agencies would enforce payment to local goods, to local public goods, in order to get the little wristbands or to hang the star in your window. If you did so without paying for public goods, you could be sued for fraud. Stateless law? Yes, that's another thing to talk about later. Keep putting that off. What I propose is something similar to the NRA in form, but instead of requiring compliance to some insane demand-side economic prescription to get a Blue Eagle, it would require the simple payment of a public good to receive a wristband and a star or something else in your window. Whatever it is. The specific image is not that important. So it's similar to the NRA, but with two significant advantages. First, it's paying for public goods, which are less controversial than arbitrarily keeping up prices and wages. More people agree on having public goods than on keeping up prices and wages. And second, the enforcement of this system is much simpler than the enforcement of the NRA. Instead of having to audit the books of NRA members and check the exchanges and check the receipts to make sure the prices and the wages are kept up to these artificially high levels, you just see if they paid the required fees to the police, fire, and whatever other public services are needed to get that little star. It's a much simpler thing, and so enforcement is much easier than with the NRA. I believe this would work, and this is, in my estimation, the least authoritarian way to go about it. Even in the current high-tax environment, people still donate $1,000 to charity per capita, which is about $300 billion in total. This has been between 2008, 2009, and 2010. To expect people to donate, at most, an additional $1,000 per head for things much more direct to them and which have a social effect, and to do this in a zero-tax environment, is perfectly reasonable and how I believe it would actually be done. However, if Homo economicus rears his head and this system fails, there is still another mechanism by which the public goods could be provided. Remember those road communitarian firms we talked about? Well, those communitarian firms are owned by the people in the area, and they can vote to deny road access to people who live in their area and don't pay for police, for fire protection, or for whatever. It would require 70% support, but that is one way to provide a public good if the more voluntary mechanisms fail. And I view voluntarism as kind of a continuum thing. If you don't like it, which I'm sure many people don't, you can move to an undeveloped area and build a new development along different lines. Now, this is not possible with states, as states basically claim the entire planet, despite not touching most of it. So now that we've dealt with funding for public goods in the abstract, let's look at them each of the major public goods most people bring up in isolation. Let's start with something easy for our individual analyses of public goods, like schools. Let's say between 1st and 12th grade there is one teacher per 30 students. At $2,000 per student, that would be $60,000 per teacher. These teachers can all get together and form their schools, and they can live off of $40,000 and use the other $20,000 on capital equipment. And I expect in a stateless society they would just be granted the already existing schools. Let's take an elementary school and assume there are 30 kids at $2,000 per student. That adds up to $400,000 for the teacher and $200,000 to maintain the buildings and equipment, replacing lighting, cleaning the floors, maintaining the bathrooms, and having a nurse on hand. This is really just the bare bones stuff. If you want something like a playground to be maintained, lunches made by the school, drama, art classes, that'll all cost extra. Perhaps tuition would have to be $3,000 per student for something like that. And that's not counting grants and donations. Today, tuition for private K-12 schools is about $9,000 on average. However, keep in mind that poor people today don't go to private schools a whole lot, and so private schools are going to, on average, cater to wealthier people. I can only assume private schools today are kept from being more cost efficient than they would be on a total market. They do have to be accredited by the state, after all, And all students need is good lighting, ventilation, and a place to learn. Spending on things like sports facilities, arts, music, large cathedral-like buildings, these are all unnecessary. Today, in public schools, roughly $14,000 is spent per student across the country, which, if we assume there are 30 students per teacher, would add up to $420,000 per teacher. These aren't colleges, these are middle schools and high schools. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's not some law written in the heavens that everyone needs to go to high school or go to school until they're 18. Some kids won't benefit from that, but will benefit from getting out into the workforce earlier. They'll mature quicker and have a head start on life. And following high school, things get way better. Let's assume a college has 50 students to a professor on aggregate. Each student pays $3,000 per year. That's $150,000 per professor, which can be split something like $90,000 for the professor's salaries and $60,000 for equipment, whatever is needed. Why isn't this happening? Why are public schools so expensive? Well, I'm not going to pile on and bash the poor performance of public schools. These teachers are put in impossible situations, and some kids, quite frankly, don't need to be there. But the wasteful spending is a legitimate criticism. Schooling seems like such a big issue because the state has made it into a big issue. It's not. The infrastructure is already there, and there are many ways I can think of to do schooling at all levels involving using the internet in conjunction with class time to effectively double the class size or allow students to speed through portions of the curriculum they already know. Creating a community college that's just a bunch of trailers and teachers teaching calculus or whatever. No campus, no frats, no lore, no sports, none of that wasteful BS, and no unnecessarily strict rules or deadlines, or teachers telling you how many times per semester you can go to the bathroom. The point is to learn math, or programming, or whatever. $3,000 a year, that's college. As you can see, I'm not putting forward a set model for schools. I'm just looking at the numbers and how much things cost, saying, look, it can be done easily. Just look at these numbers. The specific programs, that's an entrepreneurial issue. As for the specific arrangements for these schools, that's the purview of the capitalist and what can broadly be called social entrepreneurship, not political economy. I'm keeping it meta. But I can easily come up with things better than the current state monopoly system. Of course, expect those who benefit from the predictable, cushy, lifelong tenured jobs to oppose any introduction of efficiency or student choice into the system. I don't have a crystal ball, but I believe that most of the nonsense surrounding colleges would disappear on a free market. Things like sabbaticals, large athletic programs, dorms, frats, teaching assistants, palatial temple complex campuses. If you want to pay for that, you can pay for that yourself. But the thing is, today, there are accreditation bodies that limit the formation of new colleges, and only accredited colleges can receive funding from the state. This also has an effect on professional licensing. For example, only doctors from state-accredited schools can legally practice medicine. This puts the colleges in the guild at a competitive advantage by shutting out any alternatives or new systems, but this thing is already starting to break up. The University of Phoenix, for example, allows distance learning for cheap, and hopefully people can get over this mental barrier of brick-and-mortar institutions being superior and can get over the lore of college and the lore of campus education in general. For private firefighters, we already have a model system in place in Scottsdale called Rural Metro. What this agency does is handle fire, along with various other emergency services, on a pure private basis. That is, to get service you have to pay. However, if your house is on fire, for example, but you're a non-payer, Rural Metro will still put out the fire because you're surrounding other neighbors and the fire could spread. So they will put it out even if you're a non-payer, but they will put it out at a hefty price. Most people choose to just pay. On the whole, however, Rural Metro is much cheaper than the national average tax rate for public fire services, unionized fire services, and has been rated as one of the best firefighting and general emergency response agencies in the country, and is undoubtedly the best one for a city the size of Scottsdale. Based on how it actually happens, how private firefighting actually works, we can predict that that the firefighting agency would require most people to pay for their service on a pure private basis. If you don't pay, they'll still put out the fire. They will just charge you a very hefty fee to do so. they have to put out all fires in case the fire spreads, and that's the justification for requiring you to pay. By your home being on fire, you are putting the other homes at risk. And so the other homes are justified in putting out the fire on your property and charging you for this service. And they do this through the fire agency. Now, what about the poor in this situation? Well, there are two ways to do this. The neighbors together pay for the poor person's fire protection services through the dominant assurance pact plus ostracism model I mentioned before, or the fire agency itself just decides to provide free fire protection on a needs basis for people who show they cannot really afford it. And so my belief is that the poor people would receive fire protection by a mixture of both, and that fire agencies would choose to meet the community halfway. That is, people would cough up half the funds for a person's fire protection services, and the fire agencies would allow half payment for certain people who can't afford it, similar to how colleges do stuff like that today. One argument against this is that private firefighting agencies won't put out fires of non-payers, and so the fires will just spread. And this always seems like a strange argument to me, and it's not how actual private firefighting agencies work. And today, the incident that they're citing for this, the Cranic Fire, was actually a state-run firefighting agency. This will just be a little addendum. When you look up actual examples today of the private provision of public goods, such as roads and like these housing developments, fire services, which go above and beyond the quote public, close quote service, police services, private schools, all of these things tend to cater to the upper middle class. And and this makes sense because today those are the kinds of people who have money to pay for this over and above the taxes they are paying for the basket of services they receive today. Now, when I'm talking about a stateless society, I'm talking about a zero-tax environment in which everyone else, and coming up with mechanisms by which everyone else could have similar, quote, private, close quote, provision of these services. So that's just something to keep in mind when you look at, oh, wow, these are really expensive. Well, they're really expensive now because the kind of people that are buying these services tend to have a little bit of extra money. But moreover, whenever you read about an example of a town with private police, at least what I've come into contact with, and maybe my view is limited. I've tried to, get a realistic picture, and I haven't found any systematic study on this, but I've tried to get a realistic picture, and every time, without fail, it's always the town hires either a private police agency or a private firefighting agency because they have some budget issue, and these agencies do wonderfully. They provide more service for lower cost, but then people in the town get queasy. Oh, they're private police or they're private firefighters, and they just have a bad feeling about that, as if a government agency is more accountable? No, a government agency is less accountable because they're unionized, they have legal privileges that the quote private close quote agency does not. And I don't even think that this distinction of private and public is very useful or even meaningful at all. As of May 2008, there were 883,600 police officers in the U.S. at the state, federal, and local levels. The salary for those officers totaled roughly $45.4 billion. This does not include the Justice Department as a whole or any contracted work. This means there is less than one police officer per 300 people. And if we assume half are on duty at any given moment, which I think is a rather generous assumption, we can presume there is about one police officer for every 600 people. Now, if there were 600 people in an auditorium, would you expect one man to be able to spot and diffuse criminal activity in that auditorium? I wouldn't. But this auditorium example is misleading because in reality, these 600 people are spread out over many square miles. So the job of the police officer to prevent crime is actually much more difficult than it would be if all 600 people were in an auditorium. The average police response time to a call is 8 minutes. So if a psycho with a gun is in your house trying to kill you, you will have to call the cops, tell them what is going on, and then wait 8 minutes for the cops to arrive. If the cops arrive, they have no obligation to enter the house, and there is very good reason to suspect that they won't. During the Columbine shootings, 800 SWAT team members waited until two shooters killed 13 people and then themselves. The SWAT team members did not kill them. If 800 SWAT team members wouldn't enter a building for a school of children, do you think some beat cop is going to enter your home to save you from a psycho. The police exist primarily to protect the interests of the state. They have no legal obligation to protect you. They collect parking and traffic tickets, tow and boot cars which have too many tickets, and boldly break down the doors of suspected users of substances the state has decided you can't use. You are naked. If you want protection, get a gun. Now, I am in favor of police, but not for home invaders or even robbers, but for things like domestic disputes and fights in public. And this is because of the phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. For example, if you're alone and you see a person on the ground choking, you may intervene and try to help or try to do the Heimlich maneuver if you know it. If you aren't alone and everyone else around you is just looking dumbly at the choking person, you are actually less likely to try to help that person because you're looking around and you're saying, well, they're not intervening, so I guess I'm not supposed to either. This is a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. If someone is being beaten up in public, and you are less likely to intervene because everyone else is just standing around, not intervening. And so you think, oh, I guess I'm not supposed to intervene either. Cops, however, are to be trained for this and to realize when pluralistic ignorance is setting in. Not only that, but when cops get to work, they go to work prepared for combat. Whereas you or I may be capable for combat if we got prepared and got our stuff ready, but we're not ready all the time, and a cop would be. Police in malls and other large public centers are already funded by companies, and in the absence of a state, we can only expect more of them. But for the little guy, how do we get cops on call for domestic disturbances? Well, ideally, the various levels of police, federal, state, county, and municipal, would have to be consolidated into the county and municipal level. There are roughly 150 million wage earners in the U.S., and current spending on police ends up being about $800 per wage earner per year. The advantages of stateless police is that they're not a monopoly and they can be replaced. Accountability is not to a court system which is all buddy-buddy with them, but by horizontally competing agencies. They also wouldn't be fighting a war on drugs, unless, of course, there are enough people willing to donate to fund it. Also, the current pension funds would all be canceled, and so that will save us some money. So a very safe estimate for the cost of police services in a stateless society would be $500 per wage earner per year. I don't have a crystal ball, that's just a nice round number, and it's not something too radical. That's what I'm going to put forward here. Well, we already have a large police infrastructure in place that is funded through taxation, and so we can expect the former government agencies to be the best in place, to be the best positioned to handle police services in a stateless society, and to an extent kind of proceed over into a stateless society as if it was just a change of government or a change in the way they do police services, not a complete uprooting. If there is crime in an area, police need to be on call to stop it in that area and in conjunction with other police units. They cannot be hamstrung by having to figure out who paid and who didn't. So for police, you can have a similar service to fire protection. The police would be pure private for most people, and they would charge very high rates for someone who wasn't paying and ended up needing their service, except for the poor who would get free police protection as a result of the DAPO system and from the police agency providing free services to the poor, perhaps meeting halfway. The police would be on call for everyone, including non-payers. Once whatever emergency is resolved, then payment issues would be sorted out. Today there are roughly 150 million wage earners in the U.S., or half the population. This is the amount spent on each service at federal, state, and local level in the U.S. in 2010. If we divide the number of wage earners into each block, it comes out to this. And all of that adds up to $2,722 per wage earner per year. Based on my previous analyses of public goods, I've come to these conservative estimates of the cost of public goods in a stateless society per wage earner per year. And all of this would add up to $950 per year. Really, what are called public services can be provided on a pure private basis most of the time. And so the DAPO system wouldn't be in place to fund the public goods completely, but would just be used to fund the portion of those who couldn't pay. So I think a better way to describe my proposition is to put it all together in an imaginary city here. Let's take Culver City. Culver City is an average city. It has 30,000 people. Most people in Culver City pay for the local police and fire services on a pure private basis. However, 10% of the people in the city cannot afford these services. In the city is the Culver City Civic Duty Association, or just the Civic Duty Association, or I'll just refer to it as the CDA. To be a member of the CDA, you have to pay for those who cannot afford schools, police, or fire services into a common pool. This pool then covers the public services for whoever couldn't afford it. And this pool is needs tested. In order to receive CDA funds, you basically have to prove that you're poor, and the definition of poor is determined by the CDA. Members of the CDA get to hang little stars in their shops and wear identifying wristbands. The local police agency and fire protection agency actually make deals with the CDA to split the difference. That is, they'll accept half payment for people who are CDA fund recipients. The school system in the city is mostly pure private, with most people easily being able to afford the $3,000 to $4,000 a year tuition. But there are those who cannot afford it, and those who cannot get free schooling paid for by the CDA and by the school itself, which agrees to accept half payments for those with financial issues. Almost everyone in the city is in the CDA, and every store is. It only costs $300 a year to hang up that CDA star on your window, and so it's worth it for businesses to do this, because they would lose far more than that each month from customers choosing to just walk by, casually boycott stores which don't pay into the CDA fund.